There, nestled beneath the veils of creeping ivy and the shadow of the towering oaks, stood the chapel of Eldershire, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. For decades, its bell had remained silent, the once proud tower a hollow monument to a bygone time. Now, only the wind dared to whisper through the cracked windows, and the air was thick with a musty scent of decay. The village, long abandoned, had left the chapel to rot in isolation, forgotten by the world, but not forgotten by the land. Eldershire's dark past had left an indelible mark upon the chapel, a stain of sorrow that could never be scrubbed away. The story of Eldershire was not one often spoken aloud. Its name was a quiet murmur among the people of nearby villages, an area so secluded that even the most adventurous souls thought twice before setting foot in it. Once a thriving community, Eldershire had fallen victim to something far older than the passage of time, something that could not be explained with simple words or reasoning. It was a curse, they said, a curse that had taken root deep within the soil, twisting the very foundation of the land, and a curse that found its home in the chapel upon the hill. The bell, which had once echoed the mournful tones of the passing days, now rested in silence. Yet, despite the years of neglect, despite the winding paths of bramble and thorn, it was said that on the rarest of nights, the bell would ring again. And when it did, the people who heard it spoke of a strange, unearthly resonance that sent chills crawling along the spine. Some claimed they could hear it far beyond the hills, in the valleys where the fog clung to the earth like a lover's embrace. It was a sound that should not have been heard, a sound that could not be explained by mere superstition or imagination. The bell tolled, and with it, the past was summoned. Few knew how long it had been since the chapel's last service, for the villagers had slowly faded into obscurity. But those who had grown up in the area, those who remembered, could recall the time when the chapel was filled with the laughter of children and the somber prayers of the elders. In those days, the bell had been a beacon, a warning and a call to the faithful. It rang for weddings, for funerals, for every moment in life that required recognition. But somewhere in the years that followed, the tolling had become irregular. One by one, the villagers had disappeared, their lives claimed by some unknown force, and the chapel had grown silent. As the last person left the village, they sealed the doors, boarded up the windows, and left the cursed place to stand against the ravages of time. Yet time, as it always does, is an unkind master. It eroded the walls, ate away at the wooden pews, and cracked the foundation beneath the chapel. The wind howled through the broken doors, dragging with it the whispered memories of those who had once worshipped here. Eldershire was no longer a place of sanctuary. It had become a tomb. The legend of the chapel, however, was not so easily forgotten. The villagers had known of its power, of the curse that had begun long before the bell had stopped tolling. It was a tale told in hushed tones, a story passed down through generations of an ancient rite that had been performed in the dark recesses of the chapel's stone walls. No one spoke of it openly, but the elders knew. The bell had been rung for a reason. Some said it was a sacrifice, a plea to the gods of old, to ensure that the village would thrive for another century. Others whispered that it was not just a sacrifice of flesh, but of soul, a dark trade made in the quietest hours of night. The very land itself seemed to carry the weight of that bargain, the earth saturated with sorrow, as if the soil had absorbed the lives lost, and with each toll of the bell, the land wept. But even those who believed in the curse of Eldershire could not explain why the bell had fallen silent. It was as though the chapel itself had been locked away, the key buried deep within its foundations. Time had passed, and with it, the villagers had become nothing more than fleeting memories, as insubstantial as the fog that crept through the valley. Yet the chapel remained, silent, waiting. And then, one evening, the bell tolled again. It was no ordinary toll. There was something wrong about it. Those who heard it, few as they were, spoke of a deep, resonating sound that echoed through the very bones of the earth, as if the bell were tolling not for the dead, but for the living. The sound reached deep into the hearts of those who heard it, pulling them towards the chapel, toward the forgotten place on the hill where the darkness had waited for so long. For some, the bell was a call to action, a summons to uncover the truth. For others, it was a warning, a reminder that the past never truly stays buried. They said that when the bell tolled, the very air seemed to shift, growing heavier, thick with the weight of the curse. The mist rolled in, rising from the valley below and creeping up the hills, curling around the broken chapel like an old, familiar friend. The first time the bell tolled after years of silence, only one person dared approach the chapel. A young man named Thomas Hawk, a historian fascinated by the myths surrounding the village and its forgotten people. Armed with nothing but his curiosity and an old journal he had found in the archives of a nearby town, Thomas set out to unravel the mystery of Eldershire. He had heard the rumors, of course, of the strange happenings, the disappearances, the eerie tolling of the bell. But he had never believed in such things. He was a man of reason, a scholar who believed that history could be explained, that every story had a rational answer. The tales of Eldershire were just that, tales, fables, myths. Yet, as he climbed the overgrown path toward the chapel, something gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. He could feel the weight of history pressing upon him, as though the very land was trying to hold him back. But he pressed forward, determined to find the answers. And as he reached the chapel's rotting doors, something stirred within him. An unsettling sensation that he had walked into a place where time itself had stopped. The bell had tolled, and with it, the past had been awakened. Thomas stepped across the threshold, and the door creaked closed behind him. The air inside was cold, almost suffocating. And yet, there was something more. A presence, as if the chapel itself were watching him, waiting for him to uncover what had been buried for so long. He didn't know it yet, but Thomas Hawk had just stepped into a story far older, far darker than he could have ever imagined. The bell had rung, and the mysteries of Eldershire were about to reveal themselves in ways no one could predict. The wind picked up as Thomas Hawk made his way deeper into the chapel, the scent of damp stone and mildew stinging his nostrils. The bell, its toll fading with the shadows, left an eerie silence in its wake. Yet, as he ventured further, Thomas began to feel an uncomfortable presence, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. His footsteps echoed through the empty halls, mingling with the distant creak of the beams above. Each sound was magnified in the stillness, making the chapel seem alive in ways he couldn't quite understand. Eldershire had been abandoned for decades, its once bustling village now a collection of ruins and forgotten memories. Yet, despite the years of neglect, it still held an undeniable weight. There was a heaviness to the air here, a feeling that time had not simply passed, but had been trapped, as if the village itself had been sealed away from the rest of the world. The chapel, a silent sentinel, stood in the heart of this forgotten place, its rotting timbers and crumbling walls serving as a testament to the lost history of Eldershire. It wasn't until Thomas reached the altar that he felt a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change. like the space itself had shifted, drawn tighter. His eyes scanned the room, settling on the remnants of a faded mural above the altar, its once vivid colors now smudged and worn. It depicted a figure in dark robes, standing beneath a great bell, their face obscured in shadow. The symbolism was striking. There was something about the figure that unnerved Thomas, though he couldn't place exactly why. It was as if the very image was watching him, studying him from beyond the veil of time. His hand instinctively reached for the journal he'd brought with him. The pages were filled with sketches of the chapel and the town, along with notes detailing the various rumors and stories that had been passed down over the years. The most consistent story was that the chapel was cursed, a place where something dark had occurred long ago. There were whispers of strange rituals, of offerings made to forgotten gods, and of the bell tolling for reasons unknown. No one truly understood why the bell had stopped ringing, nor why it had begun again. Thomas flipped through the pages, searching for any clue that might shed light on the mystery that was unfolding before him. One passage caught his eye, a note scrawled in the margin of an old map of Eldershire. When the bell rings, the veil between worlds grows thin. The lost souls of Eldershire remain, trapped in the darkness of the chapel, waiting for the bell to toll again. He had dismissed it at first as mere superstition, but now, standing in the chapel with the lingering echoes of the bell in his ears, the words seemed to take on a more sinister meaning. What did it mean for the bell to toll once more? And why had it chosen this moment to ring again, after all these years of silence? As if in answer to his unspoken question, a sudden gust of wind howled through the broken windows, rattling the old glass. The air grew colder still, and the walls seemed to groan in protest. Thomas looked up, startled, but there was no sign of anything unusual. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, that something, or someone, was in this place with him, lurking just beyond his vision. He turned his attention back to the altar, where a faded yet unmistakable shape seemed to move in the shadows. A fleeting silhouette, as if something had passed through the chapel unseen. His heart quickened, and a shiver ran down his spine. He knew he should leave. He should turn around, walk out of this cursed place, and never look back. But there was a force within him, a pull that kept him rooted in place. The curiosity, the need to understand what had happened here, was overpowering. Steeling himself, Thomas moved forward, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. His eyes were drawn to the far corner of the chapel, where the faded image of a door lay hidden behind layers of dust and cobwebs. Something about it seemed out of place, too ordinary in a chapel that had long since fallen into disrepair. The door was solid, old, and heavy, but it had a strange quality, as though it had been left untouched for centuries. He reached out, pushing against the door. It creaked, protesting against the force, but after a moment, it slowly gave way. The air behind the door was thick, almost oppressive, and the moment Thomas stepped into the darkened room, the temperature dropped sharply. He fumbled for his lantern, the small flame flickering weakly in the cold. But it did little to chase away the growing sense of unease that wrapped around him like a suffocating shroud. The room was small and narrow, lined with stone shelves that had once held religious relics, books, and scrolls, but now stood empty. The walls were covered in strange symbols, ancient runes that Thomas could not read, but that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. They seemed to writhe and twist as if alive, their shapes shifting in the flickering lantern light. It was as though the room itself was trying to tell him something. But the message remained just out of reach. hidden behind the veil of time. At the far end of the room, there was another altar, this one much smaller and far more weathered than the one in the main chapel. A single candle sat atop it, its wick long since snuffed out, but the faint scent of burning wax lingered in the air. Thomas stepped closer, the hairs on the back of his neck rising as he did. There, carved into the stone of the altar, were more runes, and beneath them, a strange symbol that looked like a bell with its clapper broken in two. A shiver ran through him. The symbol was unmistakable. It was the bell. But why was it here, in this hidden room, carved into the very stone? The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of forgotten rituals. The more Thomas studied the symbols, the more he felt a sense of dread growing within him. This was no ordinary chapel. It was a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had been blurred, where ancient rites had been performed to call upon forces beyond understanding. And now it seemed those forces were stirring once again. As if in answer to his thoughts, the bell tolled again. The sound was deafening, vibrating through the walls and shaking the very ground beneath his feet. Thomas staggered back, his heart racing in his chest. The bell was ringing, louder than ever before, and it seemed to be coming from deep within the earth itself, from beneath the chapel, from a place where the light of the living had never reached. He turned to flee, but the room seemed to shift, the walls closing in on him, the shadows twisting and contorting like living things. His lantern flickered and went out, plunging him into complete darkness. The bell tolled again, and with it, a whisper, low, guttural, and unintelligible, seemed to fill the room, creeping into his very soul. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the bell stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stood frozen in place, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew, deep within his bones, that whatever had awakened in Eldershire was not finished. The bell had tolled, and it had called something into the world, something that had been waiting. The bell tolled again. It was no longer the faint, eerie ring that had filled the chapel earlier. This time, the sound was thunderous, as though the earth itself had been split open. It reverberated through Thomas's chest, shaking his very bones, and the world seemed to tremble in response. His heart raced, his breath caught in his throat as the bell's deep, resounding chime echoed in his ears. Each toll was a blow, a call to something he could neither comprehend nor escape. Thomas stumbled back, his feet faltering on the cold stone floor as he tried to make sense of what was happening. His hand groped for the walls of the small, hidden room, his fingertips brushing against the rough stone as his mind raced to piece together the fragments of the nightmare that had begun to unfold. The air around him seemed to warp, the shadows stretching and twisting as if the darkness itself was alive, closing in on him. The bell, louder now, rang again, its clangs echoing like a great beast in the belly of the earth. And beneath it, there was something more. Something that lurked just beneath the surface of the sound, a low rumble that spoke of ancient power, of things that should never have been disturbed. The sound was maddening, filling the room with an oppressive weight, suffocating Thomas with its sheer force. His mind spun, each thought a blur as he stumbled out of the room, the air pressing heavily against him. He was desperate to leave, to escape the grasp of whatever forces had been awakened by the tolling bell. But the chapel itself seemed to shift around him. The door, which he had entered through only moments before, was gone, replaced by a wall of stone. There was no way out. He was trapped, surrounded by the darkness that now seemed to pulse with life. The bell's tolls became erratic, chaotic, as if the very rhythm of time was unraveling. Each strike sent a tremor through the ground, and the walls of the chapel groaned as if the building itself was being torn apart by the forces that had been unleashed. Thomas's breath was ragged as he staggered back to the altar, his eyes wild, searching for an answer, any explanation that could make sense of what he was experiencing. He had heard the stories, the rumors, the whispers about Eldershire and its cursed chapel, the legends of the bell, which had once tolled for the dead and the living alike, and of the dark rituals performed in the chapel's shadowy corners. But he had never believed them. He had thought them nothing more than superstition, the stories of frightened villagers with too much time on their hands and too little sense. But now, standing in the very heart of Eldershire, Thomas realized the terrible truth. The legends were not myths at all. They were warnings. The tolling grew louder, more insistent, as if the bell were calling to something far beyond the chapel. A shiver ran down Thomas's spine as he heard a faint sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the dark recesses of the chapel. He froze, his pulse quickening. There was no one else here. No one but him. The village had been abandoned for years, and the bell had long been silent, save for this recent haunting. But the footsteps grew closer, each step growing louder in the silence that had followed the bell's ringing. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was in the chapel with him. But who? And what did they want? "Who's there?" Thomas called, his voice trembling with the weight of his fear. There was no answer, only the sound of the footsteps, growing louder and more pronounced. The darkness around him seemed to press in, thickening with each passing moment. Thomas's lantern flickered once more, casting long, wavering shadows across the chapel's cracked stone floors. He gripped it tightly, the light dim and feeble in the face of the overwhelming darkness that surrounded him. The footsteps continued, drawing closer still. Thomas's breath quickened, and he turned, scanning the room for any sign of life, any movement. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for the source of the sound. And then, as if the darkness itself had given birth to it, a figure emerged from the gloom. It was a man, or at least, it appeared to be. His form was tall and gaunt, draped in tattered robes that fluttered with each step he took, as if the very air around him trembled. His face was hidden beneath the hood of his cloak, his features obscured by the shadows that clung to him like a second skin. There was an otherworldly quality to him, as though he was not entirely of this world. Thomas froze, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure stepped into the light. The man's eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to gaze right through him, as if they could see the very depths of his soul. The air grew even colder as the figure raised a hand, and for a moment, Thomas thought he saw the faintest glimmer of something ancient and dark, move beneath the skin of the man's hand. The bell tolled again, louder than ever before, drowning out Thomas's thoughts. It seemed to resonate with the figure in front of him, as if they were one and the same. The man's lips parted in a slow, deliberate motion, and though no words came, Thomas could hear them, whispers faint but insistent, seeping into his mind like a poison. "Return what was taken. Return it," the whispers seemed to say. The bell tolls for those who have forgotten. The room around Thomas seemed to shift again, the walls warping, bending, as though the very fabric of reality was being stretched. The figure took a step closer, and the air grew even colder, thick with the scent of something decayed and forgotten. Thomas's mind spun, his thoughts spiraling into confusion. What did the figure mean? What had been taken? The man took another step, and Thomas instinctively stepped back, his body cold with fear. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs refused to move. It was as if the air itself was holding him in place, binding him to this nightmare. "Who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The figure's head tilted slightly, as though considering the question. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised a hand to his hood, pulling it back to reveal a face twisted in unnatural agony. The skin was ashen, stretched tight across a skull-like visage. His eyes, those dark, empty sockets, stared into Thomas's soul, and in that instant, Thomas understood. This was not a man. This was something older, something far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. "I am the keeper of the bell," the figure rasped, his voice a guttural whisper that sent chills through Thomas's spine. "And you have awoken what was meant to stay asleep." The bell tolled once more, louder than ever before. Thomas fell to his knees, his hands trembling as the sound pierced through him. The world around him seemed to crumble, as though the very chapel was coming apart at the seams. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the bell fell silent. The figure was gone. Thomas was left alone in the darkness, surrounded by the remnants of a forgotten history, a history that was not finished with him yet. The silence was suffocating. For a long moment, Thomas remained on his knees, struggling to regain his breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. His eyes were wide, locked on the spot where the figure had vanished. But there was nothing now. Just the same crumbling stone of the chapel and the lingering chill in the air. The bell, that horrible, relentless bell, had fallen silent once more. But its echoes still vibrated in the very core of his being. It was as though the sound had carved itself into his soul, and now he could not rid himself of it. It was a wound that would not heal. He could not explain what had just happened. The figure, the man with hollow eyes, had vanished into the shadows like a ghost, an apparition summoned by the toll of the bell. But this wasn't just some passing dream or hallucination. This was something real, something that had been waiting for him, something that had been waiting for the bell to toll again. Thomas slowly pushed himself up, his legs unsteady beneath him as he rose. His mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of the nightmare. The figure had claimed to be the keeper of the bell. But what did that mean? What had he awakened by stepping into this cursed chapel? And what was this curse that the people of Eldershire had left behind? The bell tolled again, a distant echo that reached Thomas from far away. He flinched, his body reacting instinctively to the sound. The tolling had become a part of him now. Its call was insistent, relentless. It demanded his attention, beckoning him deeper into the web of darkness that had ensnared Eldershire. He could no longer deny it. He was a part of this story now, whether he wanted to be or not. Turning, he began to walk toward the altar once more, his eyes scanning the room as he moved. He felt a compulsion to understand what had happened here, to uncover the truth hidden within the crumbling walls of the chapel. The room felt oppressive, suffocating with the weight of the past. The air was thick with the remnants of long-forgotten rituals, the faint scent of incense, and something else. A rotting, decayed smell that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Thomas approached the altar, his hand resting lightly on its worn surface. The surface felt cold, unnaturally so, and the cracks in the stone seemed to pulse with a faint energy, as though the chapel itself was alive, breathing in the silence. As his fingers brushed against the ancient stone, he felt a sudden tremor, barely noticeable, but enough to make him pause. He had read the stories, the legends of Eldershire. The town, once prosperous, had fallen into ruin after the villagers had made a terrible bargain with something dark. A power, a force that they had summoned in exchange for prosperity and protection. It was said that the people had built the chapel to appease this power, to contain it, to keep it from spreading beyond the confines of the village. But there had been a price, a sacrifice, a dark ritual. The bell, the tolling of which had once marked the passing of the seasons, had been part of that ritual, a key to binding the darkness to the land. And now the bell had tolled again. As Thomas stood there, contemplating the dark history of Eldershire, something in the shadows shifted. A faint creak echoed from the back of the chapel, followed by the sound of slow footsteps. Footsteps that seemed to emerge from the very walls themselves, as though the stones were giving way to the presence that haunted them. Thomas spun around, but saw nothing. Only the empty chapel, the broken windows through which the moonlight barely pierced, casting long, thin beams of light that stretched across the cold stone. His breath quickened as his mind raced. The figure, the keeper of the bell, had warned him, had told him that he had awakened something that had been waiting. The people of Eldershire had performed a ritual, yes, but the truth was more horrifying than he had imagined. It wasn't just a curse. They had opened a door. And now, that door was calling to him. A low, guttural voice whispered from the shadows, just beyond his reach. A voice that seemed to seep into his very soul. You seek answers, but you cannot escape what was set in motion long ago. Thomas's heart leapt into his throat. The voice was not human. It was something older, something far darker. It resonated with the very air around him, vibrating in the bones of the chapel. He could feel the weight of its presence, its power, pressing against him, suffocating him. It was as if the chapel itself were alive, with the echoes of a forgotten past, a history buried beneath layers of stone and time. Who are you? Thomas whispered, his voice shaking. But the answer came not in words, but in a rush of images, visions that flooded his mind. He saw the villagers, ancient, their faces twisted with desperation and fear. He saw the ritual, the gathering of the villagers in the chapel, their hands raised in supplication to a dark god whose name was never spoken aloud. And he saw the bell, great and powerful, its tolling the signal that the bargain had been made. The ritual had worked. Eldershire had prospered. But the price was steep. The bell had tolled for the last time, and in its wake the village had withered, its people lost to the darkness they had called upon. The images faded, leaving Thomas breathless, his body trembling with the force of the visions. He staggered back, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. The curse was not simply a tale told to scare children. It was the legacy of a people who had bargained with forces they could never hope to understand. The bell had tolled to bind that darkness, but now the bell had tolled again. And in doing so, it had reopened the door, allowing the ancient forces to stir once more. Thomas's eyes locked onto the altar once more. There, nestled in the shadows, he saw something new, something that had not been there before. A small, worn book, its pages yellowed with age, lay half hidden beneath the stone. He reached for it, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. The cover was embossed with strange symbols, the same symbols he had seen carved into the altar earlier. But these were different, more intricate, more detailed, as though they held a deeper meaning. He opened the book, and the first page was covered with a strange, flowing script, one that he could not read, but felt compelled to decipher. The text seemed to shimmer before his eyes, twisting and shifting as though it were alive. The words on the page seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though they were calling to him, beckoning him deeper into the mystery of Eldershire. The bell tolled again, louder now, the sound shaking the very foundation of the chapel. And in the echo of that tolling, Thomas realized the truth. He had awakened something, and the curse of Eldershire had not finished with him yet. The door had been opened, and there was no turning back. The first time Thomas Hawke stepped into the mists, he hadn't known it was a mistake. The fog, which rose in a dense, creeping blanket from the valley below, had seemed harmless at first, just another natural phenomenon to add to the eerie atmosphere that surrounded Eldershire. But as the fog thickened, curling around the chapel and filling the air with its damp, suffocating weight, Thomas began to sense that it was more than just a fog. It was the very breath of the curse, an extension of the darkness that had lain dormant for so many years. The bell had tolled once more, the sound now a distant, haunting reminder of the past's unyielding grip on the present. The night air was thick with anticipation, as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something to unfold. And in the center of it all, the mist swirled like an entity unto itself, undulating with a life of its own. Thomas had left the chapel, his mind reeling with what he had uncovered. The curse, the rituals, the dark history of Eldershire. It had been more than he could comprehend, more than he could accept. But now, standing in the heart of the village, surrounded by the fog that seemed to close in from all sides, he knew there was no escaping it. The village had been abandoned for years, but its ghosts, its memories, were very much alive. The mist was alive too. He could feel its weight pressing against him, its tendrils creeping around his legs, coiling around his feet like grasping fingers. The further he walked, the thicker the fog became, obscuring the path ahead, shrouding the ruined buildings in a cloak of gray. He reached out, but his hand barely cut through the air before his fingers disappeared into the mist. The very essence of Eldershire seemed to have been swallowed by it, leaving behind only the remnants of a place that had once been full of life. As he walked deeper into the village, the eerie silence that had once been his companion now felt oppressive, suffocating. The buildings, broken and decayed, were mere shadows in the mist. Here and there, broken windows stared out like hollow eyes, and the skeletal remains of homes seemed to lean in on themselves, as if they had once known something, some knowledge of what had happened to the village, to its people. And then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, little more than the soft rustling of the wind. But as the fog thickened, the whispers grew louder, becoming words, phrases, too faint to catch, but persistent. They seemed to come from all directions at once. Beneath his feet, above his head, behind him, in front of him. There was no place in the fog where they didn't reach him. The voices were low and distant, like a murmur from another world, and they filled the air with an unsettling sense of dread. They spoke in tongues Thomas didn't understand. Their words twisted and fragmented, as though they had been carried through the very bones of the earth itself. He paused, his breath shallow in the thickening air, straining to hear what the whispers were saying. They spoke of sorrow, of betrayal, of forgotten promises that had been broken, and of lives that had been lost to the very land that had once cradled them. But there was something more beneath the surface of the whispers, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind, something darker, older, and far more malevolent. It was as if the fog itself were trying to communicate with him, to draw him deeper into the heart of the mystery that had claimed Eldershire. But the further he went, the more he felt that it was not just the village's ghosts that haunted him. The fog seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its tendrils curling around his legs, urging him forward as if it had a purpose, like it was alive, like it had been waiting for him. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed on, the whispers growing louder, their words more insistent. He couldn't understand what they were saying, but the sense of urgency was unmistakable. The fog thickened, and the air grew colder, carrying with it the scent of something decayed, something long dead. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist, so faint at first that Thomas thought it was a trick of his mind. But then, the figure took form, slowly, deliberately, as if stepping from the very fog itself. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothing, her face hidden beneath a veil of dark, matted hair. She was tall, impossibly so, and her body seemed to sway in the mist like a ghost. Her eyes were empty, hollowed-out sockets, and her skin, though once pale, was now stretched tight over her bones, giving her the appearance of something that had not walked the earth for years. She was not alone. Behind her, a procession of figures slowly materialized, rising from the fog like forgotten souls returning to claim what had been lost. They were the people of Eldershire, or at least they had once been. Their faces were twisted in agony, their eyes wide with terror, their forms decayed, their clothes in tatters. They moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick fog, their hands outstretched toward Thomas as if beckoning him forward. He felt a cold chill crawl up his spine, his body frozen in place. The figures seemed to float, hovering above the ground as they advanced toward him, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt unnatural. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were calling him by name. "Thomas." The voice was soft, yet unmistakable. It echoed in his mind, reverberating through his very thoughts. He turned, searching for the source, but saw nothing in the swirling fog. The woman in front of him tilted her head, her hollow eyes locked onto his with a chilling intensity. Slowly, her mouth opened, and the words that came from her lips were not spoken aloud, but whispered directly into his mind. "Return what was taken." The words sent a shiver down his spine, and Thomas instinctively stepped back. He had no idea what she meant or what was being demanded of him, but the sense of urgency was overwhelming. The figures of Eldershire continued to move toward him, their silent procession slow and deliberate, like a gathering storm. He wanted to run, to flee from the nightmare that had unfolded before him, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, caught in the thrall of the fog in the cursed procession of souls. Their eyes were all on him, their unblinking gaze pressing into him with a weight that threatened to crush him. The bell tolled again, its sound deep and resonant, as though it were calling him, urging him to return to the chapel, to face the truth of what had happened in Eldershire. But Thomas knew, deep down, that whatever the bell was summoning, it was not something he could escape. The fog had come for him, and there was no turning back. The whispers grew louder still, the figures of the villagers closing in on him, their skeletal hands reaching toward him, and the woman at the head of the procession spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Return what was taken, or you will be lost with us." The mists swirled, and the world around Thomas seemed to unravel. He was trapped, caught between the fog and the ghosts of Eldershire, with no escape in sight. And as the figures closed in on him, their hollow eyes fixed on his, the truth became clear. Eldershire had never been abandoned. It had been waiting for him. The fog pressed in on him, thick and suffocating, as Thomas stumbled backward, his legs shaky beneath him. The procession of villagers, their eyes hollow, their limbs withered, surrounded him now. He could feel their presence even before he saw them, the weight of their empty gazes pressing into him like an unbearable weight. The woman at the forefront was still watching him, with those terrifying, blank eyes, her voice still echoing in his mind. "Return what was taken, or you will be lost with us." Each word felt like a cold hand tightening around his chest. It was as though the very land was speaking to him, the mists carrying the cries of the forgotten. He could feel the pull, the lure of whatever they demanded. But it was not just fear that held him in place. It was a strange compulsion, a force that seemed to weave its way into his mind, making it impossible to think, to move, to breathe without their presence. It was a darkness, ancient and malevolent, and it wanted something from him. His thoughts flashed back to the journal, to the strange symbols and the ancient rituals that had been performed here. The villagers had made a pact with something older than time itself, a power that had taken root in Eldershire, twisted the land, and claimed the souls of its people. But it wasn't just their souls that had been taken. No, there was something else, something far worse, something that had been sacrificed to seal the curse away. And now, it seemed, the bell had tolled again, because that sacrifice had been undone. The door had been opened, and the restless souls of Eldershire had returned, demanding restitution. But what had been taken? And why was he the one they were calling? Thomas's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his fractured understanding. He had come here seeking answers, believing that the past of Eldershire could be explained, that its mysteries could be unraveled. But the truth was far more horrifying than he had imagined. The village had never been abandoned. It had simply been locked away, its curse contained by the tolling of the bell. And now that bell had summoned him. The figures drew closer, their forms flickering in the mist like half-remembered nightmares. And as they moved, the fog seemed to shift with them, as though they were one and the same. The woman reached out her skeletal hand, her fingers long and gnarled, her nails sharp as bone. Thomas's body responded without thought. He took a step back, his mind screaming at him to run, but his feet felt like lead, unwilling to obey. The woman's voice whispered again, soft and insistent. "Return what was taken." Her hand reached for his, and for a moment, Thomas felt a strange sensation, a shock of cold that pierced through his very soul. It wasn't the touch of a ghost. It was something more profound. It was as though the very land had reached out and claimed him, drawing him into the fold of its long-forgotten curse. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the weight of the villagers' souls, and the suffocating pressure of the fog that seemed to close in on him from all sides. There was no escape. And then, in the depth of his despair, Thomas understood. The bell, the tolling, it wasn't just a signal of death. It was a warning. The villagers hadn't been cursed because they had summoned the darkness. They had been cursed because they had tried to lock it away. Eldershire had been built upon a foundation of secrets, secrets that had been buried deep beneath the chapel. And the bell had been the key, the tool used to seal the curse, to keep the land from falling into the hands of the dark forces that had claimed it. But the bell's toll had been broken, its power undone. And now, the restless spirits of Eldershire were free to reclaim what had been lost. "Return what was taken," the woman repeated, her voice growing louder, her presence more intense. It was as though the fog itself were alive, breathing through her words. The keeper must return it. The word keeper echoed in his mind like a clarion call. Thomas had no idea what it meant. He didn't know what he was meant to return, but he understood the stakes. The woman's eyes, though hollow and empty, gleamed with a terrible, knowing light. The figures behind her moved slowly, their limbs stiff, their bodies broken. But their eyes were fixed on him, and in them, Thomas saw something he had not seen before. The souls of Eldershire were not angry. They were not vengeful. They were lost. They had been forgotten by time, but they had never left. They were bound to the land by a force older than they could understand, and now they were calling on him to do what had to be done, to return what had been taken. But what had been taken? And how could he, a stranger to this place, possibly know what they meant? Why had they chosen him to fulfill this task? There had to be an answer, a key to unlocking this terrible mystery. He turned away from the procession, the air around him thick with the oppressive weight of their presence. His thoughts were a blur, spinning in frantic circles as the mist seemed to close in tighter. He needed to think, needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. It was then that he remembered the book, the one he had found in the hidden room beneath the altar. The strange, ancient tome with the symbols he had not understood. He had assumed it was just another relic of the past, a meaningless artifact from a time long gone. But now, in the face of the spirits of Eldershire, he realized that the book might hold the answers he sought. It might be the key to unlocking whatever had been taken from the land. Thomas's hands shook as he pulled the book from his pack, the pages rustling as he flipped through them. The symbols danced before his eyes, their meanings still elusive. But something in the book seemed to resonate with the fog, with the souls that surrounded him. The words, though incomprehensible, seemed to call to him, urging him forward, beckoning him to understand. He stopped on one page, a page that seemed to shimmer with an eerie glow, as though the very ink of the words was alive. The passage was short, written in a language that was unfamiliar. But as Thomas read it, the meaning became clear. The keeper must return the bell to the earth. Only then will the land be free of its curse. Only then will the souls be released. Thomas stared at the words, his heart racing. The bell. The bell had to be returned. But where? Where had it gone? Had it been stolen, lost, or buried beneath the very stones of the chapel? He had to find it. He had to return the bell before the souls of Eldershire were lost forever. He closed the book with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the task that lay ahead. The spirits of Eldershire were still watching him, their hollow eyes fixed on his every movement. They were waiting for him to act, to make the right choice. And as the fog pressed closer, as the air grew colder, Thomas realized that he had no choice but to follow the whispers, to return the bell, and end the curse that had haunted this land for so long. But the question remained, where was the bell? The mists were no longer just a veil of fog. They had become a living thing, a tangible presence that curled and coiled around Thomas like an unseen hand, guiding him forward. The whispering voices, once faint, now filled the air with urgency. their words growing louder, more insistent with each passing moment. The souls of Eldershire were restless, and the pull to uncover the truth, to return what had been taken, had never been more overpowering. The bell. The word echoed in Thomas's mind, as though it were his only purpose. The bell had tolled for so many years, marking the passage of time, the lives of the villagers, the endless cycle of birth, death, and ritual. But what had happened to it? Where had it gone? And why was it now at the heart of the curse that had gripped Eldershire for so long? Thomas's feet seemed to move of their own accord, the mists parting before him as if they were guiding him. The figure of the woman in the tattered clothing and the procession of the dead had disappeared, but their presence remained, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Their eyes still followed him, unblinking, their hollow gaze pulling him toward the very core of Eldershire, the place where the bell had once stood tall. The chapel. He turned and began to walk back in the direction of the ruins, the ancient stone structure rising through the fog like a shadow from a forgotten time. The fog, thick as ever, wrapped itself around him, the ground beneath his feet soft with decay. But still, he pressed on. Each step was a journey deeper into the past, into a time when the village had flourished, when the bell had tolled for the living and the dead alike. As he approached the chapel, the building seemed to grow taller, its once grand structure now a hollow shell of its former self. The bell tower loomed above him, its empty frame reaching up into the sky like the skeletal remains of something long dead. The wooden doors, once proud and strong, were now cracked and weathered, their hinges rusted with time. The chapel's once beautiful stained glass windows had long since shattered, the shards scattered across the floor like the fragments of a broken dream. Thomas pushed open the doors, their groan a low and mournful sound as they parted. The air inside was damp, the scent of mildew and decay thick in the atmosphere. The chapel, though abandoned, still held a strange, oppressive presence. It felt alive, as though the walls themselves were watching him, waiting for him to uncover the secrets they held within. He stepped inside, his lantern casting a faint, flickering light across the room. The altar was still there, standing at the center of the chapel, though the once polished stone had been worn down by time and neglect. The floor was littered with debris, the remnants of the past scattered like the broken pieces of a forgotten world. But it was the bell tower that held his attention now. The bell, or rather, the absence of it, seemed to call to him. The tower was silent, the space once occupied by the bell now vacant, hollow. The bell that had tolled for centuries, that had been the heartbeat of Eldershire, was no longer there. But where had it gone? The woman's voice echoed in his mind again, soft and insistent. Return what was taken. The words cut through the stillness of the chapel like a knife, and Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He looked around, his gaze drawn to the tower once more. The stone walls, weathered and worn, seemed to conceal something that was hidden deep within, beneath the foundation of the chapel. He took a tentative step forward, his hand resting on the cold stone of the altar. The whispers, once faint, were now deafening in his mind, urging him to move, to find the bell, to return it to its rightful place. But as he reached for the stone of the altar, something caught his eye, something that wasn't there before. A faint glimmer of light, just beneath the altar, shone through a crack in the stone. It was barely visible, but Thomas could see it, like a spark of something ancient, something powerful. His heart raced as he knelt beside the altar, his fingers brushing against the cold stone, searching for the source of the light. And there, hidden beneath the altar, he found it. A hidden passage. The crack in the stone was wide enough for him to slip through, and with a sense of urgency, Thomas crawled through the narrow opening. The air grew colder as he descended, the stone walls pressing in around him. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the very earth was urging him forward, pulling him deeper into the unknown. The passage led him down into the bowels of the chapel, where the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The walls were damp, the stones slick with moisture. But still, Thomas pressed on. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning as if it were leading him in circles, guiding him deeper into the heart of the curse that had plagued Eldershire for so long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a large underground chamber. The air was cold and stale, but there was something else here. Something ancient, something powerful. The walls of the chamber were covered in strange symbols, their meanings lost to time. But Thomas could feel their energy, their weight, pressing down on him. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and on it there was a relic, a bell. It was smaller than the bell that had once hung in the tower, but it was unmistakably the same. The metal was tarnished and worn with age, but the shape was familiar, the design etched into its surface like a memory of a time long past. The bell sat on the pedestal, waiting for him, as though it had been placed there for this very moment. Thomas approached it cautiously, his hand trembling as he reached for the bell. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, and as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, he felt a surge of power rush through him. It was as if the bell itself had been waiting for him, calling to him, drawing him closer. He picked it up, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment his hands wrapped around the bell, the chamber seemed to come alive. The symbols on the walls pulsed with light, and the ground beneath him trembled. The bell was not just an object, it was a key, a symbol of the power that had once bound Eldershire in a curse, and now it was in his hands. But as Thomas stood there, holding the bell, the realization hit him. He couldn't just return it. The curse wasn't something that could be undone so easily. The bell had tolled because the land itself had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the keeper to return what had been taken. The price of the curse was not just one man's life. It was the entire village, the entire land, bound to the bell, bound to the curse that had once held them in place. The bell had to toll again. Thomas's hand tightened around the bell's handle as the ground beneath him rumbled. The chamber shook, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter, and the whispering voices grew louder still, as if urging him to fulfill the task that had been set before him. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the bell in his hands, and as he raised it, the tolling began. A single, deafening chime echoed through the chamber, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. The bell tolled, and with it, the curse of Eldershire was sealed once more. The bell's toll reverberated through the chamber, its sound piercing the very air with an almost tangible force. As Thomas held the bell aloft, the room seemed to respond, the stone walls groaning under the weight of the moment. It was as if the earth itself was shaking in response, trembling beneath the power of the bell's chime. The symbols on the walls flared to life, their intricate lines of energy pulsing with light, filling the chamber with an otherworldly glow. For a brief moment, everything stood still. The chamber, the bell, even the whispers in his mind. Everything paused as though time itself had taken a breath. But in that instant, Thomas felt something shift. The forces that had been watching, that had been waiting, had now stirred. The toll of the bell was not just a signal. It was a call to something far beyond the chapel, beyond Eldershire, something ancient, something that had been bound to this place by the bell's power. As the last echo of the bell's toll faded into the silence, a strange stillness took over the chamber. It was a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the very air had thickened, become denser, heavier. Thomas felt it on his skin, the oppressive weight of something vast and unseen, like a storm brewing just out of reach. It was as though the forces that had been locked away in Eldershire had begun to wake, stretching, reaching toward him with an unseen hand. His heart raced in his chest as he lowered the bell, its weight now feeling strangely lighter, as though it had fulfilled its purpose. But even as the bell rested in his hands, he knew it wasn't over. The toll had merely opened the door, and now he was standing in the midst of something far darker, something he couldn't yet understand. Something that had been waiting for the bell to toll, something that would not be silenced so easily. The air around him shifted again, and for the first time since he had entered the chapel, he felt a presence in the chamber. Something that was not human, something far older, far more powerful. He turned sharply, his pulse quickening, but there was nothing visible. The room was as silent as it had been before, save for the soft echo of his breath. But then a faint flicker of light caught his eye. It was on the far wall, where the shadows seemed to cling to the stone, undisturbed by the dim light of his lantern. There, for just a moment, Thomas thought he saw something. A shape, a shadow that wasn't quite right, something that moved in a way that defied logic. He blinked, trying to focus, but when he looked again, it was gone. The darkness seemed to stretch before him, more oppressive now, as though the shadows themselves were alive. His mind raced. He knew that what he had done, the tolling of the bell, had awakened something that had lain dormant beneath Eldershire for centuries. But what? What had the villagers done to summon this force? What had they bargained with? And why had the bell called him? The answers were just out of reach, lingering on the edge of his understanding, like a whisper in a language he could not speak. And then, the whispers returned. This time, they were no longer distant or faint. They were all around him, rising from the very stone of the chapel, flowing through the air like a current. The words, though still indistinct, carried a sense of urgency, of need. They seemed to be coming from every direction, surrounding him, pressing in on him. It was no longer just the voices of the dead, the spirits of Eldershire that had once wandered these halls. This was something more, something that was not of this world. The bell had not only awakened the souls of the village, it had opened a door to something older, something darker. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were voices, real voices, from a place beyond the veil. And they were calling to him. Return what was taken. The words echoed in his mind, louder now, more forceful. But this time, there was something more, something Thomas could not ignore. He felt it deep in his chest, the pulse of the force that had been waiting for him to open the door. It was a cold, oppressive presence, like the weight of an ancient storm gathering on the horizon. The force was here, in the room with him, moving in ways he could not see but could feel. The shadows seemed to writhe, like serpents in the dark, shifting and twisting in unnatural patterns. The temperature in the chamber dropped sharply, and Thomas could see his breath in the cold, thin air. The mist that had once surrounded Eldershire seemed to be creeping into the room, curling at his feet, rising up like a tide. It carried with it an ominous feeling, a sense of something just beyond the reach of his senses, something that was watching him, waiting. He took a step back, his hand gripping the bell tighter as he scanned the room, his lantern now flickering weakly in the growing darkness. The shadows were closing in, thickening, coiling around the walls like a living thing. But it wasn't just the shadows that were moving. It was the very air itself. The room seemed to shift, as though the walls were bending, the space distorting, warping in response to the presence that was now awake. Thomas's mind raced, the fear rising within him like a tide. The chamber, the chapel, it was no longer just a building. It had become a prison, a trap, and he was the bait. And then a voice, no, not a voice, but a sound. A low, guttural hum, a vibration that seemed to come from the very air itself, filled the room. It was like the ringing of a bell, but deeper, more resonant, vibrating through his bones. The chamber trembled again. A figure appeared in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly so, towering over him, its shape faint and indistinct, like a silhouette shrouded in darkness. Its presence filled the room, overwhelming him with a sense of power, of something ancient that had existed long before Eldershire, long before the chapel. The figure moved, gliding through the shadows with unnatural grace, its form shifting like smoke, flickering in and out of focus. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this the force that had been awakened? The power that had been waiting for the bell to toll? His hand trembled as he raised the lantern higher, trying to cast more light on the figure. But the shadows seemed to swallow it, absorbing the light like it was nothing. The figure stopped before him, its shape finally becoming more defined, though still indistinct. It was not human. It was something else. Something beyond comprehension. Its eyes, or what could have been eyes, glowed faintly in the dark. 2 pinpricks of light in the vast nothingness. "Keeper," the figure's voice said, though it was not a voice at all. It was a sound, a vibration, something that spoke directly into his mind. Thomas stumbled back, his heart racing. The figure raised a hand, and the shadows seemed to pulse around it, flowing like liquid. "The time has come," it whispered, its voice an endless echo. "You have opened the door. You are the keeper now." The weight of its words settled over Thomas like a heavy cloak. The keeper. He had heard that word before. The bell had called him. He had tolled it, and in doing so he had taken on a role he hadn't understood. The bell had not just been a signal, it had been a summons. The toll had marked him as the one who would bind or release. But what had he done? What had he released? The figure's presence grew stronger, its form becoming more solid, more real, until it loomed over him, its presence overwhelming. It reached out, and as it did, the shadows around them surged, pressing in from all sides. "You cannot undo what has been done," the figure intoned, its voice now a chilling, unyielding command. "But you must choose." The figure loomed over Thomas, its form a dark shadow that seemed to stretch across the entire chapel, its presence suffocating and unyielding. The very air around them vibrated with an eerie tension, thick with the weight of centuries of forgotten history. The shadows that had been swirling in the corners of the room now moved toward him, as if drawn by the figure's presence, pooling around its feet like an ocean of ink. Thomas stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. He had faced horrors before. He had ventured into the unknown, searching for answers, driven by curiosity and a desire to understand. But this was something else entirely. This was not a mystery to be solved. This was a force far older than the village of Eldershire, far older than anything he could comprehend. "You have awoken me." The figure's voice rumbled again, its words not just spoken, but felt in the very marrow of his bones. It wasn't a voice. It was a presence, a force that spoke directly into his mind. The weight of its power was suffocating, and Thomas felt himself shrinking beneath it. The figure's form seemed to shimmer in and out of focus, its features shifting like smoke, as though it were not fully part of the world, a creature from some forgotten realm. Its glowing eyes, two pale, faintly shimmering orbs, fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You have tolled the bell, and now you must answer for it," the figure said, its voice resonating in the chamber. "You, the keeper, the one who has broken the seal." Thomas swallowed hard, his mind racing as he tried to understand the enormity of what was happening. He had tolled the bell, yes, but he hadn't known what it meant. He hadn't known the consequences of unlocking the door to whatever lay beneath Eldershire, beneath the chapel. But now, as the figure towered over him, he realized the truth. The toll had not just awakened the spirits of the village. It had summoned something far darker, something beyond his comprehension. He glanced down at the bell still clutched in his hands. It had been the key. The bell had called the figure into existence, had brought this force into the world. But now, it seemed to pulse with an unnatural power, its metal glowing faintly in the dim light of the chapel. It was no longer just a symbol of the past. It was a conduit, a vessel for something that had been locked away for centuries. I didn't know," Thomas stammered, his voice barely a whisper. His hands were shaking as he held the bell, the weight of it now unbearable. "I didn't mean to awaken this." The figure's gaze seemed to pierce through him, its eyes unblinking, as though it could see through the very fabric of his being. "You did not know," it said, its tone soft, but laced with an ancient bitterness. "But now you must face the consequences of your actions. You have broken the seal, and the balance has shifted." The shadows around Thomas seemed to deepen, swirling in unnatural patterns, their tendrils reaching out like fingers, curling around him, pulling him toward the bell. He could feel the pull, the force of the figure's will, urging him to act, to make a choice. But what choice could he make? What was left to him now that the bell had tolled? "You must return the bell," the figure commanded, its voice now sharp, insistent. "You must return it to the earth. Only then will the curse be undone. Only then will Eldershire be free." Thomas's mind spun as he tried to process the figure's words. Return the bell? To the earth? How could he possibly know what that meant? He didn't even understand what had happened when the bell tolled. He had felt the power of it, the force that had surged through him, but he didn't know how to undo it, how to fix what he had unleashed. "The bell is the key," the figure continued, its form shifting like smoke in the air. "It has held the darkness at bay for centuries, binding it to the land. But now that it has been told, the seal is broken, and the darkness will spread unless it is returned. The earth must reclaim it. The earth must reclaim it." The words echoed in Thomas's mind, but they made little sense. What did it mean for the earth to reclaim the bell? What was this darkness that had been bound to Eldershire, and how could it be stopped? "You, keeper, must make the choice," the figure intoned. "You must choose to return the bell or allow the darkness to consume all. The fate of Eldershire, the fate of all, rests in your hands." Thomas's mind raced, his thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and fear. He felt the weight of the bell in his hands, the power it held, and he understood, in some part of him, that it was not just an object. It was a symbol of the curse that had bound the village to the land, a curse that had been broken by his actions. The bell had tolled, and in doing so, it had shattered the fragile barrier that had held the darkness at bay. The shadows seemed to press in around him, closing in like a suffocating fog. The figure before him loomed larger, its presence overwhelming, and Thomas felt a sense of helplessness wash over him. What was he supposed to do? How could he possibly return the bell? How could he undo the damage that had been done? And yet, deep within him, a spark of understanding flickered. He had come to Eldershire seeking answers, seeking to uncover the truth. But now he understood that the truth was far darker than he had imagined. The bell had not only summoned the figure, it had called upon the earth itself, drawing forth the forces that had been trapped for so long. And now, those forces were awake. The choice, he realized, was not his alone. The earth had to reclaim the bell, not just to end the curse, but to restore the balance that had been broken. The figure had spoken the truth. The bell was the key to Eldershire's fate, and the fate of everything that lay within its boundaries. If it was not returned, if the darkness was allowed to spread, there would be no stopping it. The land, the village, and the people who had once lived there would be consumed by it, lost to the very forces that had been waiting for centuries. Thomas swallowed hard, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could make the choice to restore the balance. He could choose to return the bell, to allow the earth to reclaim it, to end the curse and prevent the darkness from spreading. But as he held the bell, he felt the force of the figure's gaze pressing into him, felt the weight of the earth's power stirring beneath him. The bell was not just an object. It was a symbol of the land's ancient bond, a bond that had been broken by his own hands. The earth would reclaim it. But would it be enough to stop the darkness? "Return the bell," the figure commanded again, its voice now full of finality. Only then will the land be free. Only then will Eldershire be saved. The shadows around him seemed to writhe, pulling at him like a current. And for the first time, Thomas understood. He had become the keeper, the one who would make the choice. The fate of Eldershire rested in his hands, and he could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him. He had to return the bell. With a final, trembling breath, Thomas stepped forward, his feet heavy on the stone floor, his heart racing. The figure's eyes followed him, its gaze unblinking, as the shadows parted before him, revealing the path forward. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew that it was the only choice. And as he walked toward the heart of Eldershire, the bell still clutched in his hands, he realized that the darkness had not yet been defeated. It had only been delayed. But it was a step, a moment, and perhaps that was all they had left. The bell in Thomas's hands felt lighter with each step he took, as though the weight of the world had begun to lift from his shoulders. The shadows that had once pressed in from every corner of Eldershire now seemed to part before him, receding into the mists like a recalcitrant wave. Each footfall echoed in the silence that surrounded him, as though the very air itself was waiting, holding its breath. Eldershire had once been a village of life, of love, and of loss. But that was before the curse had taken root, before the bell had tolled its first mournful note, binding the land to something dark, something ancient. The tolling of the bell had been the signal, the call to arms for forces both seen and unseen, drawing together a tapestry of pain and sorrow that stretched across time. It had taken the village from the realm of the living, spiraling it into the abyss of forgotten history. But now, as the bell swung gently in his hands, Thomas felt something change in the air. A faint stirring of hope. The whispers that had filled his mind, once frantic and insistent, now fell silent, as though they were waiting for something. For him. He had made his choice. The earth must reclaim the bell. The figure in the shadows had spoken the truth. But the truth was far more complex than Thomas had imagined. The bell was not just a symbol. It was the key. The curse could not simply be broken, it could only be contained. The bell had to toll one final time, not to summon the darkness, but to put it back to sleep. The earth, bound to the bell, would keep the curse at bay for as long as it remained in the earth's grasp. But once it was returned, the darkness would rest again, buried beneath the chapel where it had waited for centuries. And now, Thomas was walking the final path, toward the very heart of the curse, where the bell had once been held, where the land had been corrupted by its tolling. He had come seeking answers, seeking truth. But now he understood that some questions could never be fully answered. Some mysteries were better left to rest, buried beneath the earth, in the shadows. His lantern flickered dimly as he approached the ruined chapel once more. The stones that had once stood tall were now weathered, cracked, and broken. The bell tower loomed in the distance, the once proud structure now a hollow shell, its frame empty. The land surrounding the chapel had withered, the trees twisted and gnarled, as if the curse had seeped into the very soil, corrupting everything it touched. Yet, in the midst of this decay, there was a strange beauty, an eerie stillness that felt almost sacred. Thomas reached the altar, the place where it had all begun. He could feel the weight of the bell in his hands, its cold metal now familiar, as though it had become a part of him. The fog that had once encased Eldershire was now a distant memory, the air clearer, though still heavy with an ancient, unseen presence. The earth beneath his feet was soft, almost tender, as though it had been waiting for him to return what had been taken. He approached the pedestal where the bell had once rested, placing it gently on the stone surface. As his fingers brushed against the cool surface, a tremor ran through him, an echo of something far deeper, something that resided in the very bones of the earth. He closed his eyes, taking a slow, deliberate breath, allowing himself to feel the pulse of the land, the heartbeat of the earth that had once been tethered to the bell. The tolling had been the price of Eldershire's prosperity, the price of life and of death. The bell had marked the turning of the seasons, the passage of time, but it had also served as a vessel for the darkness that had been locked away. Now, as Thomas stood before the pedestal, he knew that the final toll was not for the land, nor for the village, but for him. He was the keeper, the one who had unlocked the door, and now he was the one who would close it. The bell had called to him, had led him here, and now it was time for him to release it back to the earth, to return it to the place where it belonged. As he raised the bell, its weight felt oddly familiar, as though it had been waiting for him, just as he had been waiting for it. His hand shook slightly, but he held it steady, his fingers wrapped firmly around the cold metal. The whispers in his mind had fallen silent, the air now still. Everything seemed to pause in that moment, holding its breath as the bell hovered above the pedestal. Then he let it fall. The sound was soft at first, almost imperceptible. But as the bell struck the earth, a deep, resonating hum filled the chapel. a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very stones, through the air, through the land itself. The ground beneath Thomas's feet shuddered, the chapel groaning as though it were awakening after a long, restless sleep. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stir, to recede into the walls, as if the bell had pushed them back, sealing them away once more. The earth trembled. A deep, rumbling sound filled the air. And for a moment, Thomas felt as though the very foundation of Eldershire was shifting, pulling itself back into place, as though the land were reclaiming what had been taken from it. The air, thick with centuries of secrets, seemed to clear, and the oppressive presence that had filled the chapel began to dissipate. The darkness that had hung over Eldershire for so long, the force that had been trapped by the bell, was now receding into the earth, its power no longer able to reach out. But even as the land settled, even as the earth reclaimed the bell, Thomas felt something inside of him, something deep, something primal shift. The bell had tolled, and the curse had been sealed once more. The land had been freed, but so had he. The weight of his actions, the burden of being the keeper, had been lifted from his shoulders, leaving behind a quiet emptiness. He had fulfilled his role. He had restored the balance, but it had come at a cost. Thomas turned from the altar, his footsteps slow, deliberate. The air around him felt lighter now, almost peaceful. The fog that had once clung to the land had lifted, leaving behind the remnants of a village long forgotten. But the quiet peace was not without its price. Eldershire had been lost to time, its secrets buried beneath layers of earth and shadow. The village had been a part of something much darker, something that had shaped its fate. And now, with the bell's final toll, that darkness had been pushed back once more. But the village, its people, their sacrifices, it would all remain a part of history, locked away in the tomb of the past. As Thomas walked toward the chapel's crumbling doors, he realized that some stories could never be fully told. Some secrets were meant to remain buried. The bell had tolled, and Eldershire was free, but its legacy would live on in the quiet whispers of the earth, in the forgotten history that had shaped it. The bell's final toll had ended the curse, but for Thomas, it was only the beginning of his own journey. The land had reclaimed its peace, but he had been marked by it, forever bound to the shadow of Eldershire. And as he stepped outside, into the pale light of dawn, he knew that Eldershire's story would live on, not just in the land, but in him. This concludes the final chapter. Would you like to revisit or expand any part of the story?